Good evening and welcome to Aware on the Air, an unrehearsed panel discussion of the U.S. government's wars and the racism they inspire. Our program is presented by members and friends of AWARE, a local peace group. AWARE is an acronym for Anti-War, Anti-Racism Effort. I'm Carl Estabrook. AWARE was established 14 years ago after the attacks of 9/11-2001 by citizens of Champaign-Urbana who realized that the U.S. government would use those crimes to justify its already long-standing attempts to exercise military control over the Middle East and its energy resources. The U.S. doesn't need oil from the Mideast, but Mideast gas and oil are needed by America's economic competitors in Europe and Asia, and so control over them gives the U.S. a major advantage over China, Germany, and other countries. The Bush and Obama administration launched wars in the Mideast and killed well over 1 million people on the excuse of 9/11. But the U.S. hasn't achieved that control. But the Obama administration hasn't stopped trying for it or stopped killing people, although they've managed to hide much of it from the American people, if not from the rest of the world. There's a Republican candidate's presidential debate tonight, and much of the media attention is directed to Donald Trump. In an important article, David Swanson points out that Donald Trump didn't vote to kill 1 million Muslims in Iraq. Hillary Clinton did. The excellent reporter Glenn Greenwald observes that the U.S. media is acting as though Donald Trump just invented racism towards Muslims. But not only is explicit bigotry towards Muslims not new, implicit bigotry towards Muslims has been the foundation of the largest public project in the United States for the past quarter century, the war in the Mideast. The driving forces behind war planning in Washington are power, domination, profit, politics, and the acquiescence in war planning as a path towards career success, as Barack Obama illustrates. Elected because the American people thought he opposed the war in the Mideast, he's in fact conducted it even more viciously than George Bush did. Sociopaths in the United States government are happy to bomb Germans or Yugoslavians. The value they place on sailors in Pearl Harbor or contemplated victims of Operation Northwoods or U.S. troops stop lost into insanity is negligible. Stop loss was a phrase that occurred in the Vietnam War where the U.S. Kept troops in, stopped the loss of troops who had come to oppose the war. U.S. government leaders don't think twice about overthrowing a democracy in Iran and laying the groundwork for Islamic power. They have no qualms about arming Muslim radicals in Afghanistan or Iraq. You should see the important new article by Andrew Coburn in the Harper's Magazine this month, which I'll link to on the AWARE Facebook page. American government leaders have no qualms about toppling secular governments in Iraq or Libya or Syria. That most Democrats and Republicans, I might add, that most ISIS weaponry is U.S. weaponry seized from Iraq can only please the profiteers who sell the weapons to combat ISIS. Their best friends are the killer Muslims running Saudi Arabia and nearby kingdoms, the major allies of the United States. But you can't keep dumping $1 trillion a year into U.S. militarism without an enemy as frightening as, actually it has to be more frightening than, the Soviet Union and nuclear holocaust to scare the American people with. In the irrational world of fear, a throat slitting is as frightening as a nuclear bomb, in fact more so. Many, many people in the United States, when they stop to think about it, recognize that the wars of recent decades have been counterproductive, creating enemies rather than eliminating them, endangering rather than protecting, costing a mountain of lives and of dollars, savagely destroying the natural environment, eroding civil liberties in the name of wars for so-called freedom, and brutalizing morality, justifying murder, torture, kidnapping, etc. But with fear and hatred of Muslims thrown into the mix, all of that clear understanding is erased by the need to kill Muslims. Suddenly a rich stew of World War II myths and Hollywood entertainment reminds everyone that only war works and nothing else is acceptable. Donald Trump didn't vote for the war in Iraq that killed 1 million Muslims. He didn't vote to fund it and escalate it over and over again. Hillary Clinton did that. Which is not to say that Trump wouldn't have done so too, or worse, if he thought it'd get him on TV more. The point is that the hatred is not new. Without it, basic U.S. policy would be understood as irrational. There are now news stories from around the United States and the world about people shunning Trump businesses and expressing fear about living in Trump-branded buildings. They're concerned that there may be an attack. No doubt among those expressing this worry are some of that majority of Americans who tell pollsters they want more war. So they recognize blowback. It's not a difficult concept. Hostility towards others produces hostility back toward you or someone taken to represent you. Pretty basic. But in advocating more war, millions of people are willing and able to hide their understanding of blowback in some fascist vault in a back corner of their brains. Sure, more war will produce more blowback, they may think, but hopefully it will hit somebody else. Children in the United States are compelled to pledge allegiance to a U.S. flag every morning and then to pray in what they call a moment of silence. They are then taught a mythologized U.S. history year after year with hardly any mention of the other 96% of humanity. Then they're told that Muslims want to slit their throats. Why? What did they do? Nothing. They'd just been shopping and watching football and minding their own business. They had a flag out front and plenty of support the troops stuff on the back of the SUV. Why? Must just be the barbarity of the Muslims. Why not kill them off? Work with the Native Americans, kill them off, but don't talk about it out loud. Only if there's a war on Al-Qaeda, support it. And if there's a war with Al-Qaeda against Syria, support that too. And if it's repackaged as a war on Al-Qaeda under a new and even scarier name, support it with a passion. And if killing them is okay, what in the world is all the fuss about over torturing them? And if torturing them is okay, what in the world could be wrong with denying them entry into the United States? This is the logic of war propaganda. Trump agrees with the Washington establishment. He just has some sort of media-driven Tourette syndrome that leads him to blurt things out. But as Noam Chomsky points out, the U.S. is increasing the possibility of large-scale terrorist attacks, similar to November 13th in Paris, by intensifying their airstrikes against the Islamic State group in Iraq and Syria. ISIS have themselves said that if you bomb us, we will attack you, and this is probably the short-term cause of the terrorist attacks carried out in Paris. If the West wants to reduce the possibility of further terrorist attacks, it needs to address the root causes of the terrorist attacks in Paris. These root causes are the U.S. invasion of Iraq and Afghanistan, as well as the Wahhabization of Sunni Islam from Saudi Arabia, which in turn resulted in the rise of global radical Islamism, and this once again under American patronage. As the leading English language reporter on the Mideast, Patrick Coburn, points out, Donald Trump is mostly right about the Middle East when he's being repeatedly interviewed as a presidential candidate. The interviewers for television and newspapers were generally hostile, or at least patronizing and incredulous, when Trump spoke positively about Russian intervention in Syria, the need to combat ISIS, and the disastrous state of Iraq and Libya. Most of what he was saying was common sense, but it's a measure of the degree to which propaganda slogans have replaced realistic discussion of these problems that his remarks were immediately dismissed or derided by politicians in the media. Asked by an NBC News presenter if Iraq and Libya had been better off when Saddam Hussein and Muammar Gaddafi were in power, a question most politicians would have dodged, Trump said, Iraq is a disaster. Libya is not even a country. You can make the case if you look at Libya, look at what we did there, it's a mess. If you look at Saddam Hussein with Iraq, look what we did there, it's a mess. This should not be controversial stuff. What is striking about these interviews is the self-confidence with which the American and British interviewers regurgitated gobbets of government propaganda and expressed surprise when Trump disagreed with them. The journalists questioning Trump appear to have accepted, without much thought and against all the evidence, the rebranding of al-Nusra and Ahrar al-Sham, which is extremist Islamist and close to the Muslim Brotherhood, as anti-Assad moderates from the moment they were attacked by Russian aircraft and missiles. Trump said in another interview that it is wrong to tell people who have had dictatorships or worse for centuries how to run their own countries. It should by now be clear that defeating ISIS and bringing it into the Syrian and Iraqi civil wars can only be brought about by agreement between the five main outside powers involved in the war: the U.S., Russia, Saudi Arabia, Iran, and Turkey. They alone have influence over allies and proxies inside Syria and Iraq to force them to negotiate seriously. Links to these articles that I'm referring to here can be found on the AWARE Facebook page. We must demand Obama end his attacks on the Mideast, including his drone assassinations, with which he's killed more than 6,000 people, including U.S. citizens and hundreds of children, and which continue. The New York Times says that Obama chooses the targets himself. He must bring home all U.S. troops, including mercenaries and bombers, and close the hundreds of U.S. foreign military bases, as Ron Zook has been describing in recent shows. We'll begin tonight with Ron, who is taking umbrage into his high dudgeon from what I hear.
A little less pretension, I might call this Tales of the South Pacific, because I want to talk about what's happening around the edge of the Pacific Ocean, which is being fortified now as basically an American lake. But since World War II, the U.S. has occupied, or at least dominated, everything around the Pacific. And the latest stories are coming from the Mariana Islands, which include Tinian and what's the other one? Saipan. And the southern Marianas would be, well, concentrated on Guam. And you may remember these names if you have heard anything about World War II and the fighting there to take these islands away from the Japanese. So they are building military bases there now, are expanding them, rehabilitating them, in addition to the Philippines that I have been talking about in previous shows. Here's an interesting article from Foreign Policy. Headline, the U.S. Navy wants to show China who's boss. Mm-hmm. Worried about China's increasing naval might, the U.S. Navy is scrambling to buy new anti-ship missiles for the first time in decades and throwing its old playbook of war strategy in the Pacific. Since the end of the Cold War, the American military has enjoyed unrivaled dominance on the high seas, with no other navy posing a serious threat. But over the last decade, China has rapidly built a naval force to be reckoned with, spending tens of billions of dollars annually to produce dozens of new warships of every size and a formidable arsenal of missiles aimed at undercutting America's naval reach. Russia has also begun to flex its muscle at sea after a long decline, launching cruise missiles last week at targets in Syria from a new stealth submarine, the Rostov-on-Don. The emerging threat from China in particular has prompted American naval commanders to reevaluate their warfighting strategy and to rush work on a new anti-ship missile for surface ships. The Pentagon plans to modify existing missiles that initially had been designed for other purposes, starting with the Tomahawk, which traditionally had been used against stationary targets on land. Well, this goes on then to describe how these bases are being reopened, modified, rehabilitated. And I've talked about Subic Bay in the Philippines a couple of times before, but here's the South China Sea where the conflict is emerging. Here is the Philippines, and here is Subic Bay right here, which is right next door to it. The Marianas are over here, and Saipan, Taiwan, Tinian, I'm sorry, and Guam. This is near the Marianas Trench, which is well known as the deepest part of the Pacific Ocean. It's about 7 miles deep there. But anyway, those little islands have international airports, and they were heavily used in Vietnam and other times as a base for the heavy bombers that were bombing Southeast Asia. So what does this mean in the longer run? I'm afraid I know. This arms buildup, another arms race, which only can, seems to me, eventuate in disaster. This same article says, as part of the effort in the Pacific, the U.S. hopes to have access to several air bases in the Philippines under a landmark defense cooperation agreement signed last year with Manila. The agreement is now under review by the Philippines Supreme Court. Although a conflict with China is considered only a remote possibility, Pentagon officials and analysts believe the mere perception that the United States has lost its military edge could have a damaging psychological impact among allies and partners. Any sign of weakness could also embolden China's military at a time when Beijing is pursuing expansionist territorial claims in the South China Sea and other disputed waters. China has made no secret of its goal of building a robust navy with global reach, able to operate in the far seas. This is known in American naval lore as the deep water or blue water navy. According to official military strategy, China released just last May, Beijing is placing a top priority on building up its naval clout. So this is reminiscent of the argument that's gone on in American military planning for over a century, since Mahan wrote about the importance of sea power. The traditional mentality that land outweighs sea must be abandoned, the Chinese are saying, and great importance has to be attached to managing the seas and oceans and protecting maritime rights and interests. To safeguard the country's sovereignty and keep shipping lanes, China needs to be building itself into a maritime power, it said. So more news of the military buildup going on there. From the Navy Times by Lance Bacon. This goes all the way back to April. The U.S. military will have access to 8 or more Filipino bases for colonial, for rotational deployments as part of its new defense agreement, according to the Philippine media, when in what looks to be a landmark basing expansion as part of the Pentagon's Asia-Pacific pivot. The Enhanced Defense Cooperation Agreement will allow the U.S. to use 8 bases for troop rotations. The general in the Philippine military said 2 of these bases are located near disputed islands in the hotly contested South China Sea. Stars and Stripes newspaper also named the other bases that were said to be being considered as expanded American bases. So I think we have to be concerned about what this will lead to. Has there ever been a arms race, an escalation, military escalation like this that resulted in anything good? I doubt it. If there's time, I'll come back to the current propaganda campaign that's centered upon our aging fleet of B-52 bombers, the Stratofortresses. And stories about these aging long-range heavy bombers have been popping up in several places. And it looks like someone, somewhere, has been planting some stories about the need to replace them with a new generation of long-range heavy bombers. Other people are saying that long-range heavy bombers of that type are obsolete, just as battleships are. And we shouldn't be sinking millions and billions and trillions of dollars into this new effort. But that will need further discussion. I'll stop there.
Thank you, Ron. You're watching Aware on the Air. We'll go to Karen Aram with probably more on Asia.
More on Asia, yeah.
Good,
Although
good,
I'm beginning
good.
to wonder about Ron repeating all the Pentagon propaganda that I try to counteract. I have an article here by Thomas Geist on the 11th talking about the Pentagon announcing their worldwide expansion of U.S. military bases. And they evidently reported this to the New York Times on Wednesday. The enlarged U.S. basing arrangements will include at least 4 new large-scale bases or hubs, including new facilities in East Africa and West Africa and Afghanistan, along with a greater number of smaller camps or spokes, sources told the Times. Now, a lot of what they say, even what they report to the Times, leaves out the fact that we have over 800 military bases. They will admit to 800 around the world, but we know that it's actually more than that. And in fact, Okinawa, we were talking about Okinawa last week, I think, Ron, and I have data here from an article by Buddy Bell, who is a member of the Voices for Peace that Kathy Kelly's involved with, and he refers to the demonstrations that are taking place now in Okinawa opposing further expansion of the military bases there. They currently have 32, and they want to expand. And one of the really serious issues of expanding and building more military bases is, I mean, the press will talk about, the bars and the sex industry that crops up around it. Actually, that's really minor. The real major concern is the land grabbing. People are displaced and they lose their land. They may be paid for it, but you have to understand, in many of these nations, being displaced means you are dislocated, because these are people who are part of almost an ancient community in a lot of places. So they lose their livelihoods, they lose their ancestor burial sites. I mean, there are so many things that it involves, and this is across Asia. And one of the things that Barry says here, which I appreciate, is that he says the proliferation of more and stronger weaponry and the establishment of economic pressure points is putting the two countries, meaning Japan and China, because everybody knows that this is all about China, okay? The containment of China by the U.S. And he says that it becomes ever more likely that a careless action by either side will end up with people killing and dying. The role of U.S. residents in this situation is not to spend a lot of time criticizing China, a country over which they exercise little control, but to focus instead on altering the course of the United States, which at the end of the day must answer to an organized populace. Chinese government policy will continue to be the main concern of the people who live in China, and the vast majority of them want fairness and security. So that's why I take somewhat askance or a very skeptical view of, for instance, Carl, we were talking online yesterday about an article by, I forget his first name, his last name is Bonds. Patrick Bonds? Mm-hmm. Okay. Yeah, he has
James.
Credentials coming out his ears.
Yep.
And I can't dispute any of the data that he provided, because most of it was very economic, and he was very skeptical of the benefits of the trade agreement between China and Africa, and the fact that China is offering $6 billion worth of funding for projects in Africa. And he was highly critical, as some people are, but he is an American, and he has a right to speak out. But here again, I wonder if he's speaking out against the ASEAN and the new Cold War battle for Eurasia's economic future, which is being presented by the TPP, as we know. And I want to mention that at the 27th summit at the end of November in Kuala Lumpur, there was an agreement to form the ASEAN Economic Community, or the AEC, in order to coordinate the bloc's economic relations with the outside world. And they go on to social, cultural, security, whatever. At the end of the day, what it will do is it will nullify a lot of the FTA, or the free trade agreements, that a lot of these nations, Southeast nations, members of ASEAN, have currently with China. And I'm not going to go into detail about this. I only read it myself just this morning. And I realize that it is another form of provocation against China by the U.S. And there's so much of this that is happening. The new bases that are taking place throughout Southeast Asia. There's something like 200 of them currently there. But that's only those that have been sort of admitted to, let's put it that way, or that are easy to acknowledge. Because what they do is they have other ones that they simply call, they're not officially acknowledged bases. They refer to them as forward operating post. So, and other long-term deployments. Right, right. So the list of the U.S. bases expands to include the majority of countries in the world. And I've got a whole list of them, but you know, all you have to do is look at a map. What is taking place, the provocation? Now, like you mentioned, Ron, the fact that the Philippines is taking China, they have taken them to the ICC to dispute not just one island, but it seems that it's a lot of islands in the South China Sea. And these islands comprise more than the 200 or something of the miles which go beyond your zone, okay, of non-interference. But it's the U.S. behind it. The U.S. is behind it. We know this. I mean, there's not even a Filipino lawyer involved in this. They're all U.S. Washington-based lawyers that are bringing this to trial. This is dangerous because China does not, they're not going to acknowledge any ruling by the ICC. And we know who pretty much will be controlling the ICC. Again, it will, evidently the U.S. has certainly more influence than the Asian nations. So there's what I see, military provocation against China, nuclear armed nation. But at the same time, when we talk about, you know, foreign policy propaganda of fear about Russia and China, military rise, at the same time, excuse me, the spending that China has as far as their military weaponry, while they are advancing considerably as far as the technology is concerned, nonetheless, they don't spend near what we do. They don't have near what we do as far as military weaponry. And it's almost all of it is really to counteract a lot of what they see happening. And as I pointed out, that's why the Chinese take land management as being extremely important, because they know what could happen if they were totally dependent upon seas for shipping and commerce, with Indonesia and Malaysia being in, so to speak, our back pocket and controlling the Malacca Straits. Now, some of that I've talked about before is changing, in that many of these Southeast Asian countries are moving further towards China, Laos and Thailand, and Indonesia is also sort of, what is the word for it, waffling. But we know that Widodo, the head of Indonesia, the president, is very much Western influenced. The U.S. feels very confident that they have him, and that is dangerous because Indonesia is very powerful in Southeast Asia. They are a very one of the world's, let's say, most profitable nations in that area. And the fear is that if they go with the TPP, that they will then be influencing the other Southeast Asians to do the same thing. So we've got both military provocations and we have the economic provocations against China, and either one is very, very dangerous. So when people criticize anything that China does, all I keep pointing out is that basically what they're doing is business. And I'm aware of China operating in Africa and the development that they're doing. I'm very aware of the dangers of development and the degradation to the environment. Again, people will probably be displaced when they come in and build up the infrastructure. It's also, so for environmental, it's also a form of capitalism, which I generally don't support. But at the same time, I keep thinking it's up to the African nations to make their decisions, how they want to proceed with China, if they want to go ahead and develop their nations develop their various nations' infrastructure with China, if it benefits the people, and then we leave it to the peoples of the African nations to take on their governments, to control their own environment and their own economies. So I will back
Thank you,
up.
Karen.
Yeah.
Appreciate that. You're watching Aware on the Air with the invocation of the serious climate questions. We'll go to David Johnson for a comment on what the Parisians have been up to.
Well, that's one of the things I want to comment about. I guess what I want to start with first is, you know, you can't have both empire and democracy. What we have now is definitely an empire of corporate control and expansion, and we have a very fragile, almost pseudo-democracy. In other words, almost a fake democracy. And this dynamic needs to be changed because, frankly, I mean, it's running us into the ground. Not just our standard of living, but our civil liberties are at risk here. And oh yes, by the way, the future of the climate of the world, the future of humanity. Because all this stuff, you know, these wars of imperial expansion just cause unbelievable damage to our climate, both in the use of just general equipment, but also the weaponry and the wars that are being supported with our tax dollars, both directly and indirectly. And this madness just has to stop. Colonel Wilkinson, U.S. Air Force retired colonel who used to be Colin Powell's chief of staff, was recently interviewed on Abby Martin's The Empire Files. And it was very interesting to listen to this man, who I've seen before interviewed on the media. Colonel Wilkinson resigned from his commission in the U.S. military, I believe it was in 2004, after learning about the U.S. military torture chamber that was activities that were going on at the Abu Ghraib prison in Iraq. By the way, there's going to be more revelations coming out here soon as far as video footage of rapes and other horrible acts that have so far been covered up by the Obama administration. But nevertheless, that was the tipping point for Colonel Wilkinson. He's mentioned that he's totally ashamed of what his role was in Colin Powell's infamous speech before the United Nations, showing cartoon caricatures to try to prove that Saddam Hussein had weapons of mass destruction, which turned out to be an absolute total lie, which was the justification for the invasion of Iraq. But anyway, Wilkinson was talking about you know, what's been happening, and basically this expansion of empire, and he called it by name, empire, is totally gone against you know, all his ideals, even though he says he's still a Republican and everything else. But he quoted, of course, the Republican President Dwight Eisenhower, who in his final farewell speech warned about the military-industrial complex. He mentioned about how the invasion of Afghanistan was only for one reason. The excuse, of course, was the 9/11 attacks, but the thing is that the United States did not have any proof that Osama bin Laden was responsible for the 9/11 attacks, enough to have an extradition warrant to serve to the Afghan Taliban government at that time, and then just basically did not give him enough time to of any kind to respond, and just use this as a pretext to invade. The reason that the invasion happened and why our military is still there 14 years later has nothing to do with democracy, peace, fighting terrorism, or any of this other propaganda nonsense. It's all about global positioning to contain, as Karen mentioned, not just China, but also Russia. It's all one big strategic chessboard, a big game that they're playing, unfortunately, with our money, our resources, endangering the planet. And it's not in the interest, and they say that in the security interest of the United States, they're not talking about your interests or my interests as working people. They're talking about maintaining and expanding the profit margins of the 1% of corporate America, and in particular, the war profiteers. I don't call them defense contractors, they're war profiteers, pure and simple. This leading to the climate change, and I guess when I end on this and tie this in with the whole climate change conference in Paris, is that you cannot believe if you watch corporate media, you cannot believe what you see or hear. It's total, pure propaganda. There is no journalism there. It's basically a corporate state propaganda news outlet. Basically, these people they call journalists now are really stenographers for the corporate state. And likewise, with all this going on, the continuous propaganda that's going on about, you know, why we're spending all this money and American lives being involved in the Middle East and other places in the world, tied into this is the recent climate conference in Paris, in which after the conference was over, by the way, a conference that in which most civil society, in other words, regular citizens organizations were excluded, and was sponsored with huge money and advertising by all these corporate entities, some of the worst polluters out there, British Petroleum, BP, you name it, came to supposedly some great agreement that was going to be basically going to make the whole climate issue, solvable. That we're definitely right track, claiming that President Obama had a big role in finally getting the world to really deal with our climate issues. Well, this was all total nonsense. If you look at any of the postings by climate scientist James Hansen or any of the reputable climate change organizations out there, not the ones that have been bought off like the Sierra Club, but the ones that are really been focusing and concerned about this issue, they all say the same thing, that this whole climate agreement in Paris was nothing but a sham. And that it's not going to solve anything as far as what needs to be done to reverse course of where we're heading, which is destruction of our planet. I mean, and of course this ties into the whole imperial war machine. So that's kind of what I want to comment about today.
Thank you, David. You're watching Aware on the Air. We'll go to Karen Evans-Levy with some comments about particularly local issues, I think. Right, Karen?
Yeah, I'm going to jump off. I'll get to the local issues, but right away I want to jump off of what David was just talking about. And so not just the profiteers of war making, but also, for instance, Donald Trump making millions of dollars off of deals that he has in the United Arab Emirates, Azerbaijan, Turkey, and Indonesia. So he's making tons of money off of what he calls, the Muslim. He doesn't want Islamic people or Muslims to come into the United States, but he's willing to do business with them in their countries, in other countries, as long as he's going to make millions of dollars off of it. And that includes big, huge hotels and golf courses and things like that, which are consuming a lot of energy and bad for the environment. So one of the things I wanted to mention about local stuff was that last night, Monday night, there was a undergraduate class, honors class, that had done. They had looked at the News Gazette to see how often race and crime were actually more highly reported for Black people than white people in the News Gazette, and they did an interesting study. It was a juniors class, a junior honors class in political science, and they did a really interesting. The paper is really very interesting, but it's also a jumping off place. They collected a bunch of data that we can then continue to take further. The only thing that they looked at was the stories that were in the News Gazette, and then compared them to people that were actually eventually either arrested and booked. And one of the things that they actually found was, you should definitely look at how the News Gazette is covering race and crime in Champaign County. But one of the interesting things that I want to pull out of there is that there were approximately, they also looked at the jail records to compare them to what the News Gazette was saying. There were exactly 5,016 arrests in a 3-month period, but only 1,497 of those people were actually booked. So people are often picked up and taken in and then released because they were found not, they're not booked with any charges. And so that's very interesting to look at, because a lot of times a story will get into the media that says, oh, this person was arrested, but a lot of the times 4 times out of 5, they've picked up somebody who didn't do the crime, and they just brought them in to question them. And so when we jump to conclusions about certain crimes that happen, like in Paris right before, they have to go through an awful lot of people before they actually get to who the actual people are that are that committed the crimes or why they did it. Anyway, I just thought I'd bring that up. This paper is really good. The title of the paper is Representation of Race and Gender in News Gazette Crime Coverage. And they used the Klein Center for Democracy at the University of Illinois to help analyze the data that they had collected. And they have a website. It's a really good group of 12 students and the professors that actually did the studies, and we'll be able to continue to work with that data and see how racism is in Champaign County.
We'll put a link to this paper too in this website, also on the AWARE Facebook page, along with links to the other papers and comments that we've mentioned tonight. In the last section of AWARE on the Air, we'll go around with some questions for and some comments on things that have already been said. I'd like to start with a question to Ron about the point he raised at the end about the revitalization, if that's properly the right word, of the American bomber fleet under the Obama administration. Quietly, the Obama administration has done more for the beneficiaries of neoliberalism than any recent administration, including such things as the Trans-Pacific Partnership, the TTIP for Europe, and the other trade agreements that are massively in the interest of the American 1% and not at all in the interest, in fact, against the interests of the majority. The same is true of the defense industries, or the war profiteers, as David rightly said. The most influential lobby in the United States, probably, certainly far more influential than the Israel lobby. But they have something else in mind for bombers, right?
Yes,
Ron?
well, what are essentially the requests for proposals have gone out for the new bombers to supersede, well, we've had a succession of them since World War II, the B-17 Flying Fortress and the B-36, the B-1, and then the B-1B and the B-2 stealth bomber, and so on. And now the line seems to be that we need a whole new generation of these things. And there's probably only 2 manufacturers that are capable of building these airplanes on that scale. And so it becomes a kind of artificial, completely meaningless game about which one of them is going to get this massive contract worth billions and in the end perhaps trillions of dollars. So it's ridiculous, but it's starting all over again. And do we need another wave, another generation of long-range heavy bombers? I think most people who looked at the situation objectively would say, no, we don't, but of course that will not weigh heavily with those who will profit from the arms buildup.
Thank you, Ron. Karen, a question or comment?
Yeah, first I'd like to ask Karen a question. Would you repeat the nations where Donald Trump has his business
Sure.
investments, please?
Yeah, well, Saudi Arabia, he has connections there
Right.
a lot. But also the United Arab Emirates.
Maradas, yeah.
Yeah. Azerbaijan,
Azerbaijan.
Turkey,
okay.
and two new ventures in Indonesia.
Oh God, Indonesia. Okay.
Yep.
Yeah, there's a lot of business interest in our allies, Muslim nations, as we know, Saudi Arabia, UAE, Qatar.
Yeah.
I never say that one right.
Oh, he has
in
interest
Dubai.
there too. Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, all of those that are our allies. None of them, of course, none of them in those that we're bombing, that we're destroying. But your point was well made, is that our government and our corporations don't have a problem with Muslims. They only have a problem with Muslims who don't have money, who don't have anything to offer. So as far as they're concerned, yeah, I think
Or
that's,
who aren't compliant.
yeah.
Or
I have one other thing I just wanted to mention is the
On
book
this
Kill.
point, though, Ron, you want to comment
Oh.
on this point?
Yeah, I wanted to ask if anyone else saw this thing. I think it was on BBC World News television last night. Flying a light plane over the or near the islands
yeah,
in the South China Sea.
I heard it. Yeah.
Yeah.
I didn't
And it was a deliberate provocation. We're probing to see, we're playing chicken to see how far we can go before China starts shooting them down.
Right, right. Usually they
And,
just warn. Usually
This
China
is
just
being done deliberately,
yeah, yeah.
systematically, and with a lot of high-minded rhetoric about we're protecting the freedom of the seas
Right.
and,
Oh, yeah, yeah.
so on. It's a matter of high principle
Right.
that we keep probing and provoking, and again,
And if ever,
it's
any
very
country,
dangerous.
and if any country ever flew too close to us, we would
Oh,
Yeah,
immediately.
yeah,
God,
right.
yes,
You know,
exactly. No,
we wouldn't even wait to.
Yeah, no, we're doing everything we can to provoke China and Russia. And the one thing, though, we're relying upon China's restraint, and they are extremely restrained. They are very patient, and they know exactly what we're doing, and they're not foolish enough to allow themselves to be drawn into this.
Certainly hope so.
However, as we know, accidents do happen. And at some point, they are not going to allow themselves to be caged. That's the point. We're trying to contain them, and we're relying upon that restraint. But this is not the same China that had been colonized and mistreated for so long by the West, by other nations, Asian nations. They won't put up with that. So it is a very dangerous game that we're playing. I wanted to mention the book Kill Chain,
Yeah.
The Rise of the High-Tech Assassins. Carl, you mentioned Andrew Coburn's. I really have a problem with pronunciation here, don't I? I
Names.
wanted to mention his you mentioned his article, which I did read, which is very valuable, but also his book, which our reading group is doing. I've only gotten halfway through it, and I think, Carl, you've talked about it amongst the group. But so far you haven't discussed it too much on Aware, and I think it's a highly valuable book. It really goes into the technology, and it gives you the behind-the-scenes activities of our military and in regards to drones. And so I do want to recommend that. But if anybody wants to discuss it, it should be Carl.
The book is the background, devastating account of the background for the world's largest, the world's most extreme terrorist campaign, as Noam Chomsky has described it. That is Barack Obama's drone assassinations around the world. The technological and defense industry, and the euphemism, background to the fact that Obama, who the New York Times says chooses all the targets for the drone strikes, is exercising right now. The book is devastating, as I say. I recommend it highly. Andrew Coburn, the brother of the man that I mentioned before about talking about Trump, Andrew Coburn is the Washington editor of Harper's Magazine. And in the current issue of Harper's Magazine, there is an article in the same style talking about how the United States is again patronizing, both senses of the word, I suppose, terrorists, Al-Qaeda, jihadists in the Middle East. Coburn's account shows how the U.S. essentially invented modern jihadism back in the 1970s in order to use it against Russia. And modern jihadism, which was invented by finding the most fanatic fighters one could find around the world, giving them arms, which they didn't have, of course, in the 70s, and sending them into Afghanistan before the Russian invasion in order to give Russia a Vietnam of its own, as Jimmy Carter's national security advisor said. The Carter administration, Democratic administration, did this. And what we have now in the Obama administration, a Democratic administration, is a further, there hasn't been a break, a further arming of these jihadist groups. Jihadism is an American product. And what Coburn's article shows is that how the jihadists of the Middle East come out of American political politics. When we write the arc of American politics in the Middle East in the 20th century and the 21st, we'll start with the fact that the heart of American policy was the destruction of secular Arab nationalism, secular Middle East nationalism, and the promotion of what we now see as Islamism, fanatical fundamentalist Islam, and it carries throughout the region. Few people, few Americans know in the discussion in the Middle East that Israel essentially founded Hamas. It's supposedly great enemy, just as the U.S. founded jihadism a generation before. This is the background of the people we're killing around the world today, and the reason that the majority of people in the world think that the greatest threat to peace in the world is not Iran or Russia, but rather the United States of America. They're quite right about that. We're in the midst of a round of questions and comments. David, if you want to add something or ask a question about what we've been saying.
That interview I referred to earlier with retired U.S. Air Force Colonel Wilkerson, during the course of the interview, they showed a chart of military spending over the last 10 years. Yeah. And what's interesting, of course, the United States spends more, I should say the United States government spends more military spending than every other country in the world combined. Right. And what's interesting, the ones who spend the most after the United States, China is number 2. Russia is number 3, and Saudi Arabia is number 4,
right.
Followed by Israel. And what's interesting is they showed that 10 years ago, China and Russia were not spending that much percentage-wise of their gross domestic product on other military as they are now. And it seems like, this kind of begs the question is, are they doing that, China in particular, what you know the most about, as a response to this sort of these gestures and acts of like containment that the United States, containment, sounds like such a nice word, but basically trying to aggressively restrict China's ability to even go very far beyond their territorial waters at all.
Well, absolutely, absolutely. And it's not just an opinion. There are many opinions and theories, but all you have to do is look at the facts. I mean, the Chinese read Zbigniew Brzezinski's book, okay, on the Grand Chessboard in the 90s. They've read, people have to understand, their leader, Xi Jinping, these people have read all of anything that we have access to, they have access to. They know exactly what our planning is. So it has been in reaction. And I don't have the figures with me now, I used to have it, but you're right, they have increased their military spending as we have increased ours and our containment and our provocations. But still, I don't think it's anywhere quite near where we are, but they are moving, they are advancing significantly regarding the technology.
Karen?
A local politician, I always bring it local, asked Eric Jacobson, who probably sits right around here, actually asked me who I was voting for in the presidential campaign. And I find it a funny question. The reason is, right now we're using drones and all this military and instead of diplomacy, and any president who gets elected, no matter who they are, will continue to use the drones, will continue to use the military, will fail to do diplomacy. And so in a way, who is actually president actually doesn't matter a whole lot to me, but who is actually out on the street does matter to me. That's all I'm going to say.
Thank you, Karen. I think we should consider at least the remote possibility, if we're looking for a gleam of hope in the midst of the horrors we've been describing, remote possibility that the Republican Party may become the anti-war party.
Oh, no, come on, Carl, give me a break.
Look at the evidence. Look at the evidence. We know that the Obama administration is seriously pro-war. Hillary even more so. Hillary has attacked the Obama administration from the right on the issue of his war making, and Hillary is unquestionably a pro-war and pro-Wall Street candidate. I mentioned at the top of the program the comments about Trump. and the Patrick Coburn's comments that Trump is mostly right about what the
What
U.S. has
he's-
done in the Middle East.
What he says.
And this week brought us an interesting conversation published originally, apparently, on Twitter and elsewhere, between Cruz and Rubio in the Democratic Party, where Rubio thought he saw an opening against Cruz to condemn Cruz's not being strongly enough in favor of killing Muslims. Cruz himself condemned the neocons who were pressing for more war and more war in the Middle East. He used the word neocon, which of course the Republican right doesn't do because it's always been a word used to condemn the pro-war activities of Republicans and primarily Republicans.
But even if there's a, okay,
Doesn't matter
Yeah,
who the
I just-
president is.
even if there's a personal preference and a presidential candidate gets in who doesn't have a personal preference for conducting wars in the Middle East, there will be pressure from all sorts of people, including companies and companies producing military, but also companies producing golf courses, that will want to increase the empire in the Middle East. And so how is whoever gets elected, how are they going to combat that unless they have a lot of people behind them saying, don't do it?
And
I
they
agree with
don't.
you entirely on that, Karen. There must be a strong movement in this country to oppose the war, the war in Southwest Asia, as there was in the war in Southeast Asia. What Barack Obama understood was that he could co-opt that notion and make himself president by pretending to be against the war. He wasn't. Any other candidate can do the same thing.
Exactly.
And we may find that, but what we should have is a real discussion about the war, which for the most part we haven't had because both parties, the leaders of both parties, have been in support of it. I'm happy to see some cracks in the facade, and we should see what sort of light comes through those cracks. You've been watching Aware on the Air, presented by members and friends of Aware, the anti-war, anti-racism effort of Champaign-Urbana, a local peace group in the 51st week of 2015. Another week in which the Obama administration has drone assassination program, the most extensive global terrorism campaign the world has seen, is paralleled by overwhelming police killings in the U.S., far beyond what happens in other countries. Our show is produced and directed by Jason Liggett. Thanks to him also. This program and others like it will be available on YouTube. And see the Facebook page for Aware, where I will post links to the articles that we've mentioned tonight. Finally, Aware honors those who reveal the crimes of the U.S. government, which the rest of the world knows about, but Americans don't. Manning, Assange, Snowden, and others who are being persecuted by the Obama administration. Now, this is Carl Estabrook for Ron Zoke, Karen Evans-Levy, Stuart Levy, Karen Aram, Michael Bay, David Johnson, David Green, and other members and friends of Aware, saying in the words of the late Edward Murrow, good night and good luck.